The screaming started at midnight, cutting through the Wyoming wind like a blade through frozen flesh. Samuel Crawford bolted upright in his narrow bunk, ice crystals falling from his beard as his breath formed white clouds in the suffocating darkness of his cabin. The temperature had dropped to nearly 40 below, and the storm that had been brewing for 3 days was now unleashing its full fury against the log walls. But it wasn't the wind that had awakened him. It was the sound of a human voice, desperate and dying, somewhere beyond the walls of his isolated ranch. Sam's weathered hands fumbled for his boots, his fingers stiff with cold despite the dying embers in the stone fireplace. At 47 years old, he had survived more Wyoming winters than most men could count, but this one was different. This one felt like death itself had settled over the territory, claiming everything in its path. The Morrison family had been traveling through 3 days ago, a young couple with 2 children, heading toward Cheyenne to start a new life. Sam had seen their wagon struggling against the wind from his window, but the storm had hit before he could offer shelter. The screaming came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the snow outside his corral. Sam grabbed his rifle from above the door and stepped into the brutal night, the wind immediately stealing his breath and filling his lungs with ice. The snow was falling so thick he couldn't see his own outstretched hand, but he knew every inch of his property by feel alone. He had built this ranch with his own hands 15 years ago, when the territory was still wild and unforgiving, when a man's survival depended on his wits and his willingness to face the darkness alone. Ghost materialized from the storm like a specter, his massive form appearing suddenly at Sam's side. The wolf was nearly as large as a small horse, his thick gray coat crusted with ice and snow, his yellow eyes reflecting the faint light from Sam's lantern. Most men would have shot the animal on sight, but Sam had pulled Ghost from a steel trap 3 winters ago, nursing him back to health in his barn while the wolf recovered from wounds that should have killed him. The relationship that had formed between them was something beyond understanding, a bond forged in the brutal honesty of frontier survival where loyalty meant the difference between life and death. Ghost's ears were pinned back, his massive head turned toward the corral where the sounds had originated. The wolf's behavior told Sam everything he needed to know. Something was wrong. Something that had disturbed even this creature who had faced down grizzly bears and survived blizzards that had claimed entire cattle herds. Sam followed Ghost through the knee-deep snow, his boots crunching through the frozen crust with each step, the wind howling around them like the voices of the damned. The corral gate was open, hanging on its hinges and banging against the fence posts with each gust of wind. Sam had secured that gate himself before the storm hit, checking it twice to ensure his remaining cattle wouldn't wander into the storm to freeze. But now it swung freely, and in the snow beyond the fence, he could see dark shapes scattered across the white landscape like broken dolls. His heart hammered against his ribs as he raised the lantern higher, the weak light barely penetrating the swirling snow. The first shape was his prize bull, lying on its side with its legs twisted at impossible angles, steam still rising from the massive carcass. The second was one of his breeding cows, her neck snapped clean through. But it was the third shape that made Sam's blood turn to ice water in his veins. It was human. A small figure in a blue coat, lying face down in the snow with one arm stretched toward the corral gate as if reaching for salvation that had come too late. Sam stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the body, his hands shaking as he turned the figure over. It was a child, a boy no more than 8 years old, his face blue with cold but his eyes still open, staring sightlessly at the storm above. Sam recognized him immediately. It was Tommy Morrison, the youngest son of the family that had passed through 3 days ago. The boy's clothes were torn and bloody, and there were strange marks on his exposed skin, scratches that looked almost like claw marks but too large to have come from any normal animal. Ghost circled the scene, his massive paws leaving deep tracks in the snow, his head low and his hackles raised. The wolf's behavior was unlike anything Sam had ever seen. Ghost wasn't afraid, but he was alert, scanning the darkness beyond the lantern light as if expecting something to emerge from the storm. Sam rose slowly, his rifle ready, his eyes searching the swirling snow for any sign of movement. The Morrison family had been traveling with a wagon, 2 horses, and all their worldly possessions. Where were the rest of them? A new sound cut through the wind, different from the boys screaming but equally disturbing. It was the sound of metal scraping against wood, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere near his barn. Sam turned toward the sound, Ghost falling into step beside him, both man and wolf moving with the careful precision of predators tracking dangerous prey. The barn doors were closed, exactly as Sam had left them, but the sound continued from within, steady and purposeful. Sam reached the barn door and paused, his hand on the latch, listening to the strange scraping from inside. Ghost pressed against his leg, the wolf's massive body tense and ready. Whatever was inside that barn had killed his cattle and the Morrison boy. Whatever was inside had survived 3 days in a storm that should have killed everything that drew breath. Sam lifted the latch and pulled the door open, raising his lantern into the darkness beyond. The sight that greeted him defied every rational thought his mind could form. The Morrison wagon was inside his barn, somehow transported through the storm and positioned in the exact center of the space between his feed stalls. The wagon was damaged, its canvas top shredded and its wooden side splintered as if something had torn it apart from the inside. But more disturbing was what surrounded the wagon. The snow inside the barn had been cleared away in perfect geometric patterns, forming symbols and lines that stretched across the entire floor, symbols that looked almost like a map. At the center of the pattern, directly beneath the damaged wagon, the wooden floor had been torn up, revealing a hole that disappeared into the darkness below his barn. The scraping sound was coming from the hole, along with a faint light that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Sam stepped closer, Ghost at his side, both of them drawn toward the opening despite every instinct screaming at them to run. As Sam held the lantern over the hole, he could see that it wasn't just a random excavation. Someone or something had dug down to reveal a wooden chest, partially buried but clearly visible in the pulsing light below. The chest was old, older than anything Sam had ever seen, with metal fittings that gleamed despite being buried for what must have been decades. And scattered around the chest, barely visible in the strange light, were more dark shapes that Sam realized with growing horror were the bodies of the Morrison family. But they weren't dead. At least, not all of them. As Sam watched in stunned silence, he could see slight movements from the figures below, weak and irregular, as if they were barely clinging to life after 3 days in the frozen earth. The scraping sound was coming from the father, who was using a broken piece of metal to carve symbols into the wooden sides of the chest, symbols that matched the pattern cleared in the snow above. Ghost suddenly tensed beside Sam, his ears pricked forward and his lips pulled back to reveal massive canine teeth. The wolf was staring not at the hole, but at something behind them. Sam spun around, his rifle coming up instinctively, just as a figure stepped out from behind the damaged wagon. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing clothes that belonged to no era Sam could identify. His skin was pale as winter moonlight, and his eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's. The stranger smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too white, and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. "Samuel Crawford. I have been waiting for you to find them. The Morrison family came seeking what lies beneath your land, just as others have come before them. But the chest requires a specific key to open, a key that only reveals itself to those who understand the true nature of sacrifice." Sam's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. The stranger continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The wolves of this territory have been guardians of this secret for generations, long before white men built their farms and ranches on sacred ground. Your ghost is not merely a wolf you saved, Samuel. He is the last of a bloodline that has protected this treasure for over a century. The Morrison family discovered this truth too late." The pulsing light from below grew brighter, and Sam could hear the scraping become more frantic, as if the Morrison father was racing against time to complete whatever symbols he was carving into the chest. The stranger took another step closer, his pale eyes fixed on Ghost, who stood rigid beside Sam, every muscle in his powerful body coiled for attack. "The storm was not natural, Samuel. It was called forth to bring the Morrison family to this place at this time, just as other storms have brought other seekers throughout the years. But none have possessed what you possess. None have earned the trust of the guardian wolves. The chest will only open for one who has been chosen by the pack, one who understands that some treasures are worth more than gold or silver." As the stranger spoke, Sam began to understand that everything he thought he knew about his isolated ranch, about Ghost, about the land he had called home for 15 years, was built on foundations he had never suspected. The sounds from below grew weaker, and Sam realized that the Morrison family was dying, had perhaps already died, in their desperate attempt to unlock whatever secret lay buried beneath his barn. The stranger was watching him with expectant eyes, waiting for a decision that Sam sensed would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of something much larger than himself. Ghost suddenly moved, not toward the stranger, but toward the hole in the floor, his massive form disappearing into the darkness below with silent grace. Sam heard the scraping stop abruptly, followed by a sound he couldn't identify, something between a sigh and a growl. The pulsing light grew steadier, stronger, and Sam realized that Ghost had done something down there, something that had changed the very nature of whatever was hidden in that ancient chest. The silence that followed Ghost's descent into the earth was more terrifying than any storm Sam had ever weathered. The pulsing light below had transformed into a steady golden glow, warm enough that Sam could feel its heat rising through the opening in his barn floor. The pale stranger stood motionless, his unnatural eyes fixed on the hole where Ghost had disappeared, and for the first time since his appearance, something resembling concern flickered across his gaunt features. Sam kept his rifle trained on the stranger while straining to hear any sound from below. The Morrison family had gone completely silent, and even the wind outside seemed to have diminished to barely a whisper. The golden light grew stronger, illuminating the carved symbols on his barn floor with startling clarity, and Sam realized they weren't random markings at all. They formed a detailed map, showing the location of streams, mountain peaks, and landmarks he recognized from his 15 years in Wyoming territory. But there were other symbols too, older ones that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light, symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. A low rumble emanated from the depths below, not threatening but somehow reassuring, like the sound a massive cat might make while purring. It was Ghost's voice, but deeper and more resonant than Sam had ever heard it before. The golden light pulsed once, twice, and then began to dim gradually, as if whatever power source had been feeding it was finally running low. The stranger took a step backward, his pale skin seeming to lose some of its luminescence in the fading glow. "Your wolf has done something that should not have been possible," the stranger said, his voice now carrying an edge of uncertainty. "The chest has been sealed for over 60 years, protected by magic older than this territory itself. No mortal being should have been able to breach those protections, yet your ghost has somehow accessed what lies within." Ghost's massive form emerged from the hole with fluid grace, landing silently on the barn floor beside Sam. But the wolf was carrying something in his powerful jaws, something that gleamed dully in the lantern light. It was a leather scroll, ancient and cracked but somehow preserved despite its obvious age. Ghost dropped the scroll at Sam's feet and fixed his yellow eyes on the stranger, his lips pulled back just enough to reveal the tips of his fangs. Sam bent to retrieve the scroll, his hands trembling slightly as he unrolled the brittle leather. The writing was in French, faded but still legible, and though Sam's education was limited, he could make out enough words to understand the basic meaning. It was a map, but not just any map. It detailed the location of a treasure buried by French explorers sometime in the early 1800s, a fortune in gold and silver coins that had been hidden when hostile tribes threatened their expedition through Wyoming territory. But there was more to the scroll than just the location of buried treasure. Interspersed with the French text were other symbols, drawn in a different hand with what looked like blood-red ink. These symbols matched the ones carved into his barn floor, and as Sam studied them more closely, he began to understand that they told a different story entirely. They spoke of guardians, of ancient pacts made between the French explorers and the wolf packs that roamed this land, agreements that bound both species to protect the treasure until a worthy successor could be found. The Morrison family discovered fragments of this map in an old trading post near Cheyenne, the stranger continued, his voice now carrying a note of grudging respect. They spent months researching the symbols, learning about the connection between the French explorers and the wolves of this territory. But they made a crucial error in their understanding. They believed the treasure was merely gold and silver, something they could claim and spend. They never understood that the real treasure was the knowledge itself, the understanding of what lies beneath the surface of this seemingly empty land. Sam looked up from the scroll to find Ghost watching him intently, those yellow eyes seeming to convey more intelligence than any wolf should possess. For the first time, Sam began to question everything he thought he knew about his companion. Had Ghost truly been caught in a trap 3 years ago, or had the wolf deliberately allowed himself to be captured? Had their meeting been coincidence, or something far more purposeful? The golden light from below flickered once more and then died completely, plunging the barn into the dim illumination of Sam's lantern. In the sudden darkness, Sam could hear movement from the hole, the sound of bodies shifting and what might have been whispered voices. The Morrison family was still alive down there, but Sam sensed that their condition was far from normal. Something had happened to them during their 3 days in the earth, something that had changed them in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The French explorers who buried this treasure were not ordinary men, the stranger said, moving closer to the hole but keeping careful distance from Ghost. They had learned secrets from the native tribes, knowledge about the true nature of this land and the creatures that inhabit it. When they realized they could not safely transport their gold back to civilization, they made a pact with the wolf packs of this region. The wolves would guard the treasure, and in return, they would be granted abilities that went far beyond those of ordinary animals. Ghost's ears pricked forward at the stranger's words, and Sam noticed that the wolf's breathing had become synchronized with his own, as if they were sharing more than just the air in the barn. The sensation was unlike anything Sam had ever experienced, a connection that seemed to flow directly from Ghost's mind into his own. Through that connection, Sam began to understand things that his rational mind insisted were impossible. The treasure buried beneath his barn was not just gold and silver. It contained artifacts that the French explorers had acquired from tribes that understood the deeper mysteries of the American frontier. Items that could influence weather patterns, communicate across vast distances, and forge bonds between humans and animals that transcended normal understanding. The Morrison family had sought these artifacts, but they had lacked the one thing necessary to claim them safely, the trust of the guardian wolves. Ghost is not just any wolf, Sam said slowly, the words coming from some deep understanding that he couldn't quite explain. He's descended from the original guardians, isn't he? The wolves that made the pact with the French explorers. The stranger nodded, his pale features showing what might have been approval. The bloodline has been maintained for over 6 decades, passed down through generations of wolves that have watched over this land. But the guardianship requires more than just animal instinct. It requires a human partner, someone who has proven themselves worthy of the wolves' trust. The French explorers had such partners among the native tribes. When those partnerships ended, the guardianship remained dormant, waiting for someone new to emerge. Sam looked down at Ghost, seeing his companion with completely new eyes. The wolf's apparent loyalty, his uncanny ability to appear exactly when needed, his unusual intelligence and behavior, all of it suddenly made sense. Ghost had been testing him for 3 years, evaluating his character and his worthiness to become part of something larger than himself. The fact that Sam had saved Ghost from the trap had been the beginning of the evaluation, not the end of it. A new sound emerged from the hole below, the distinct sound of footsteps on wooden rungs. Someone was climbing up from the depths, moving slowly but steadily toward the barn floor. Sam raised his rifle instinctively, but Ghost's calm demeanor suggested that whatever was emerging posed no immediate threat. The first figure to appear was Morrison himself, the father of the family, but he looked fundamentally changed by his experience below ground. Morrison's clothes were torn and dirty, but his skin had an unusual pallor that reminded Sam uncomfortably of the stranger's appearance. His eyes, when they met Sam's, held a depth of knowledge that seemed impossible for a simple homesteader to possess. Behind him came Mrs. Morrison and their surviving daughter, both showing the same pale complexion and eerily intelligent gaze. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost wolf-like, and Sam noticed that Ghost showed no signs of aggression toward them, despite their obviously altered state. "We found the chamber below," Morrison said, his voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate in Sam's chest. "The artifacts are still there, preserved by the same forces that kept us alive during the storm. But we learned something down there that changes everything we thought we knew about this territory. The treasure isn't meant to be claimed by any one person or family. It's meant to be protected, maintained, and used only when the survival of this land itself is threatened." Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, holding something small and dark in her hands. It was a piece of metal, carved with symbols that matched those on the scroll and the barn floor. This is the key to understanding what the French explorers really discovered, she said. They learned that this land is connected to others, places that exist beyond normal geography. The artifacts below can open pathways to those places, but only for those who have been chosen by the guardian wolves. Sam looked at the metal piece, then at Ghost, then at the strange assembly of people in his barn. Everything he had believed about his isolated ranch, his simple life as a cattleman, his relationship with Ghost, was being swept away like snow before a spring thaw. The stranger, who had remained silent during the Morrison family's emergence, now spoke with a tone of finality. The storm that brought the Morrison family here was not the first of its kind, and it will not be the last. There are others who seek these artifacts, people who understand their power but not their purpose. The guardianship that has protected this place for 60 years is about to face its greatest test. Samuel Crawford, you must decide now whether you will accept the responsibility that Ghost has been preparing you for, or whether you will abandon it and face the consequences of that choice. Ghost moved closer to Sam, pressing his massive body against his human partner's leg. Through their connection, Sam could feel the weight of generations of wolves who had maintained their vigil over this land, protecting secrets that could reshape the understanding of the American frontier. He could sense the presence of other guardian pairs scattered across the territory, humans and wolves bound together by purposes that transcended individual survival. The scroll in Sam's hands began to warm, responding to his proximity to Ghost and his growing acceptance of what he was being asked to become. The French text faded, replaced by symbols that he could somehow read as clearly as English, symbols that told the true story of the treasure beneath his barn and the role he was meant to play in protecting it. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the barn's wooden walls, Sam realized that the storm outside had completely stopped. The sudden silence was profound, and through the small windows, he could see that the snow had ceased falling and the clouds were beginning to break apart. But more importantly, he could sense other presences moving across the landscape, both human and animal, converging on his ranch with purposes that ranged from protective to predatory. The choice that lay before him was not just about accepting guardianship of a buried treasure. It was about joining a network of protectors that had maintained the balance between the known and unknown aspects of the American frontier for generations. It was about acknowledging that the land he had called home for 15 years held secrets that could change the course of history itself, and that he had been chosen to help protect those secrets from those who would misuse them. Ghost's yellow eyes met his own, and in that gaze, Sam saw not just the intelligence of an individual wolf, but the accumulated wisdom of an entire bloodline dedicated to a purpose greater than any single life. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the mystical heritage that lay buried beneath the Wyoming soil, waiting for the right guardian to ensure its protection for generations yet to come.